cool. I wanted to do a really quick video just about how to set up a turntable. So I have this random sort of vase of flowers chilling here on this crappy background, and I'm just going to go ahead. This is like metal, which is just hard to see. So we'll go ahead and just turn that back to Lambert 1. So this is what we have pretty much. And there's a few things that you want to make sure of when you're doing turntables. One, a lot of people will be like, you must put this on some kind of little platform or something. So if that's not usually a thing that I'll like hardcore require. But usually, you know, you just make some kind of little base or something like that. And then if you wanted to, and I would recommend this, like if you're going to make a base, unless you're working low poly, I would, you know, take the extra 10 seconds and just go ahead and make sure that it can be smoothed as necessary. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just like add a little bit more sort of random detail in here and nothing super fancy. I'm just going to go ahead and like extrude out a little bottom piece for this so that it has, I guess, very, very small amount of extra visual interest. And the other thing for some reason that I'm personally just partial to on these kinds of things is having just like a little lip around the top, and I don't know, that's just personally an aesthetic thing that I enjoy for some odd reason. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just, you know, something really, really stupid and simple. Very much not a fancy thing that I've just set up here. I will add a few more edge loops to just like harden that because it looks terrible. But anywho. And then if you wanted to, for some reason I can never just like stop refining. Great. All right, that looks worse than when I started, but whatever. So we have this, and I'm just going to go ahead and cheat and move both this and the background down until things aren't clipping. And you also want to make sure, obviously, that like everything's actually sitting on this pedestal. So now we have like the basic, I guess, structure of this turntable. We can go ahead and I deleted half the pedals on this. We can go ahead and actually start spinning this. So what I'm going to do. Here's just a group of all of my vase stuff. I'm going to go ahead and just parent that directly under the cylinder so that when you rotate this, it's going to take the rest of the flower pot with it. That's the easiest way to do stuff. The one thing that you do usually want to make sure of is just like a polish thing, is that this group here, we're going to ignore the stem clipping, that this group here is not sort of spinning around. Like you want it to be sort of centered in the object, and obviously depending on what you're making, that's going to look different for everything. But it looks way more polished if your object, like the main part, in this case I'm going to say the vase, is just sitting in the middle of the scene, or sorry, in the middle of your turntable. So what I'm going to do in this case to ensure that is just grab the vertice and snap that to the bottom center of this vase, and then go ahead and with vertex snapping just pop that right into the center of this thing, so that now whenever I'm rotating this, that vase is always centered in the scene. So like I said, depending on the object and what you're doing, it, you know, makes sense to do things, maybe offset it a very tiny amount. In this case, I like the vase being centered. So that's something you're also going to, like I said, want to look out for. Apart from that, it's pretty much just setting up the turntable itself, and there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Apparently there's like an auto create turntable button. I prefer setting things up manually because I just like to have the additional control. So what I'm going to do is go through, and for a nice turntable, I like about 2 frames a second, or wait, no, that makes no sense. Sorry. I like about 720 frames, so you're rotating about 0.5 degrees every frame of rotation, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab the little cylinder base thing that I made, and on frame 1 I'll set a keyframe at 0, go to 720, and set another frame at 360 degrees. So once that's done, you should be able to scrub through your timeline and see that that is rotating nicely. The other thing that you want to look out with, and actually for the purposes of demonstration, so if you're not going to do 720 frames, what I'll usually do is do 360 frames. And that way you at least get, you know, for each frame you render, you're getting 1 degree of rotation. You can fudge it and slow it down a little bit if you need to, but it gives you a lot of information where you're just sort of rotating slowly enough that people can actually see your object, right? Like if it's spinning like this, it's really hard to see the nice detail that you worked and put into stuff. So one thing you'll notice is like if we play through this, it's going to start slow, get faster towards the middle, and then it's going to slow down aggressively towards the end. It's like slowing down, and then it stops, and then it goes again. And that's something that you definitely want to avoid when doing turntables. What have I done? I don't think I've set a keyframe on 360 proper. I moved the keyframe wrong. So that's something you want to definitely avoid. And the easiest way to do that I've found is to go into your Windows, animation editors, and graph editor. And you don't really need to understand how the graph editor works to do this, but all you want to do is basically just marquee select over everything and hit this little button here for linearized tangents. Basically, the graph editor is just a visual representation of what your animation is doing, how things are translating through space. So instead of having that like slow sort of curve, you can see it's like slow. The shallower slope is basically representing slower change. So instead of having that slow and then ramp up and then slow back down, when you linearize those tangents, it's going from point A to point B. So now you'll notice if we put our thing here, it doesn't really slow down, it just keeps going, and it's a much, much nicer loop when you set it up like this. So that's something that I particularly look for if you're going to set up your own turntables. Other than that, I mean, it's pretty much just kind of going through and rendering stuff out like you normally would. Make sure, again, that you have some kind of background. Ow! In terms of render settings, what you would want to do is just go ahead, select your image format, something less stupid than an if. The only thing you really want to do is go through and set this to pretty much anything that doesn't say single frame. If it's set to single frame, you're going to have to render each thing out individually, which is terrible. So this is the one I'm partial to, just name _ extension. And what you can do is rename your scene if you want, so you just do like flowers turn tab. And then it's going to basically go through and be like flowers, turn tab, and then insert whatever frame number you're rendering. So if you're on frame 30, it's going to be frame 30, etc. And it'll give you a really nice sort of ordered list of files. Once you're done, it's going to be really easy to compile later. Apart from that, you just want to go and set your start and your end frame to whatever you want them to be. The by frame is if you want to render, say, every 10th frame or something like that. So a lot of times I'll do this, I'll just render every 45th frame, or like you just pick a small increment and go through and render every frame. So like if you do every 30th, it's going to render frame 1, it's going to render frame 30, frame 61, etc. And this is a good way to test and just make sure that your lighting is kind of like makes sense. You don't have any insane shadows showing up where you don't expect them to be, without rendering every single frame of the turntable. Because there's nothing worse than spending like 30 hours rendering a thing to be like, oops, there's a giant shadow halfway through and now I need to re-render the whole thing with new lighting. And then the rest of the standard, like renderable cameras, all that stuff. And just for the record, by default, this is set to 1. If you set this to 1, it's going to render every frame like you would expect. You can also, if you want it to, set it to decimal frames, and this will basically render like 4 frames for every frame. Sometimes kind of maybe helpful for Sims, maybe, but like and you should be good to just render. If you're using Arnold, you want to go into the rendering menu, do render, and Arnold, you should use render sequence. They give you some options to like override other camera settings, so just like pay attention to that. If you use batch render with Arnold, it's going to go through and watermark everything. Redshift, you can use either of them. I prefer batch render where applicable. And you just need an actual license for it to not watermark your stuff. So that's basically setting up a turntable. The only other thing that I really want to touch on is sort of positioning your object in the scene, right? So normally if I'm doing a turntable, what you want to avoid, for one, is something like this where you can just obviously see off the edge of your ground plane that looks really sloppy. Same thing like here. You'd want to have something in that background. Usually if I'm going to do that, I'll just be like, cool, I've made a little bend in my table background thing, and just call it a day. So definitely make sure you don't see off the background. Like I said, it just looks really sloppy. The other thing you want to avoid is being really far away from your object so that you can't even see what's happening. Right, so like this is so far away. Like if you're rendering several hundred frames to show off an object, you want to see the object, because like presumably it's something nice that you've worked on. So I don't really care personally if the base gets cut off. I am also not super picky about like if the object itself gets cut off, to an extent, right? So it's like, I wouldn't necessarily want to do something like this where you're rendering just like, and you're cutting off the entire top flower, like that looks really sloppy. But personally for me, if I'm doing something like this, and maybe that bottom flower, which is just sort of there for like a little extra flavor, is cut off for a few frames, to me, that's not the end of the world. I mostly, like I said, just, what the heck did I do to the stem? I mostly just like to make sure that like I have not cut off most of the object or something crazy like that. So framing is important. The other thing that I kind of want to touch on is, I guess, unusually shaped objects. So for some stuff, like a computer keyboard is a good example, like a sword is another decent example. Rendering a traditional turntable is maybe not the best option. So I do actually have a sword just floating around somewhere. If you give me 5 seconds, I will find that and pull it up. Daggers, Daedric dagger. Too many files, guys. Like, way too many files. Great. These are all very, very large, high-density files, and they scare me, frankly. Wow, that's not at all modeled to scale. My original scene is like the size of one of these dots. So something like this, you know, it's going to be super hard to see what's happening if you just have this spinning around, right? So like originally what we had is, so I'll just keyframe this at 0 and keyframe this at 360. Just having this spin is not particularly, it's not doing a great job of showing off my object because based on the shape, it's just so far away that you can't really see it. So there's a few ways that I would generally approach this. One is to just make a sort of alternative turntable where I'm just going to see what happens if I throw this in a group and then rotate it. So basically you can turn this whole thing into like some kind of weird barbecue spit. And at least this way you're making a little bit better use of your space, where you get the sort of longer side for the longer part of the dagger. You could also, if you were so inclined, do this on a diagonal and just sort of be like, I'm going to mash this as close into screen as I possibly can, and just sort of render it like this. It looks a little weird to me. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of this, and that's like, again, I just cut off like the tiniest tip of that and like kind of bothers me. It's one thing if it's, I guess, like this, I maybe wouldn't want to cut that off just because it's the main object that I'm focusing on, right? Like that other flower was just sort of there, whereas this is like, I am showing off this and only this object, so I would like the whole object wherever possible to not be chopped off. So the other thing that you could do, and this is I think my personal preference for this, is basically render that alternative sort of turntable where I'm going to like flip this on its side, and then instead of doing, this is on its side like a weird direction, it's bothering me. So what I could actually do is maybe do like a quick shot of the dagger, and instead of just having it spinning on screen, you could just sort of go in and like zoom and just sort of like pan along the object, right? Because this way you're really seeing all of these crazy details that are in here. I actually had one where I sculpted in detail on there, but anywho. But it's going to give you more options to sort of show off your colors, and then, or not the colors, like the model itself. And then you could also come through in like some different angles and do some stuff. So let me just go through and see what this looks like. I will get rid of the keyframes on this, do something very bad and just keyframe my perspective camera, and I'll set this up really quickly. Like I said, this is not going to be elegant in the slightest, but perhaps if we come through and we do something like this, and then we sort of scroll along to here and start like rotating a little bit, Oops, I am not keyframing my perspective camera, am I? No, I am not. Great. So normally you would set up, like I said, another sort of render for this, but I am not doing that because I am bad. So, great. And just setting this up like a maniac. All right, cool. So perhaps we have, what in the actual heck have I done here? All right, well, I've clearly done something very strange with the rotation of this, which is why it's usually good to not set things up like this. Ooh, goodness. That's entirely nauseating. But yeah, I don't know. I could set that up again. I don't feel like it's going to do a huge purpose. But like I said, play around with like alternate ways to display weird, irregularly shaped objects like this. Otherwise, it's basically the same principle. What you can do if you wanted to is go into your graph editor once you're done. Yes. And theoretically, you could, like I said, just sort of select all this stuff again and then linearize those tangents. And in this case, it's probably like a weird decision just because of how it's moving. But that's going to ensure that you don't have that weird sort of like speeding up and then slowing down effect as you're moving through the scene. Hopefully that was helpful. Most of the technical information was definitely in the beginning of this, but yeah.